Welcome to the Central Ideas podcast. This is Marius and Vic. Today, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Jacqueline Anson. She's a professor at Central Methodist University. Dr. Anson holds advanced degrees in both experimental psychology, and she got her master's degree at the University of Colorado, and social psychology, and she got her Ph.D. at the University of Rochester. Her research interests include human motivation, the psychology of religion and politics, experimental and existential psychology. Dr. Anson, it's nice to have you here.
Thank you, Marius. I'm happy to be here.
How are you doing?
Great, thank you.
Today we're going to be looking at a myriad of topics. I think we should start, though, with your research. You have been doing some research with some stellar scientists. I've looked them up. Thousands of citations on ideology and terror management theory. So if you could briefly, or as expensively as you want, explain what the terror management theory really is.
All right, that's what I would like to do, and I would like to just clarify, I myself, since I left grad school, have not done a lot of research on terror management, but I am certainly able to talk about what it is, where it came from, how it fits in, to applications to the larger topics that we'll be talking about today. So terror management theory is actually based on the philosophy of a cultural anthropologist by the name of Ernest Becker, who wrote a book in, I believe it's 1962, it was released, called The Birth and Death of Meaning. And in this book, he outlines this idea that we as humans, being living organisms, and like all other living organisms, have an instinct to survive. It is built in. We want to be passing on those genes, but at the same time, we're unique from other animals and organisms in the fact that we can contemplate our own death. Most other animals are just sort of going along. They're not thinking about their past. They're not thinking about their future. Our unique, huge brain allows us to project into the future and to look around us and to realize, hey, I'm not going to be here forever, and there's nothing I can do about that. So Becker argues that this combination of knowledge, of knowing that we're going to die, but having this hardwired instinct to survive, creates the potential for great anxiety. Okay, and the main term here is to pay attention to is potential. Okay, we all know what anxious is or anxiety is. We know whenever we have a test later in the day, we're anxious about that test, and it pretty much consumes everything that we do until we take the test, especially if we're not prepared for the test. We're constantly thinking about the test. What's going to be on the test? I don't know how I'm going to do on the test. We're constantly anxious about this. Okay. So we all know what that feels like, but we don't have that exact experience with our anxiety about death, right? If we walked around all day long going, I wonder when I'm going to die. I wonder when I'm going to die. Oh no, is it going to be now? Is it going to be tomorrow? Is it going to be the next day? We wouldn't be able to function, right? So the interesting question becomes, how are we dealing with this? If there's this huge existential anxiety, what's going on that we're able to just sort of walk through life and be okay with this? Okay, so terror management theory, along with Becker, comes up with this idea that we adopt and adhere to what is called a cultural worldview. And this is just sort of a personal philosophy that we adopt that tells us how the world works, what we should value, what's important, how we should act, what we should believe. Okay, so the cultural worldview is this monolith of stuff that we walk around with. Usually we pick up through socialization, but it gives meaning to our lives on one hand, but it also, most cultural worldviews have something built into it that allows for either symbolic or literal immortality. Okay, for example, if you believe in heaven, it's literal immortality. When you die, you're not really dying, you're moving on to somewhere else. Or we also talk a lot about symbolic immortality, which is this idea that we will continue on in other people's hearts and minds. Our ideas will go on. And so we're maybe not literally going to be here, but some part of us will be left behind.
And our genes will live on as well.
Exactly, and I'm sure we're going to come
children.
around to this eventually too, later in the conversation.
Mhm.
Okay, so we adopt this cultural worldview, we adhere to it, we live up to its standards, and by doing that, we gain self-esteem. And according to terror management theory, it's this self-esteem, this feeling good about who we are and where we are in life, that buffers the potential anxiety. Okay, so far so good. We've got our little system. We're adhering to all of the rules of our system, whatever it is, and we're feeling fine in the face of death. The problem is not everyone has the same cultural worldview, right? So when we butt up against people, which we do all the time, who have different cultural worldviews, that takes down our defense a little bit, right? It's like, wait a minute, how can their cultural view be right and my cultural view is right? Now what do I do, right? So this is where the terror management theory people came in. And their hypothesis was that if we remind people of their mortality and then present them with a person who has a worldview dissimilar from their own, that we, in response, would derogate, dismiss at the lightest, well, they don't know what they're talking about, or derogate.
It's the easiest way of not challenging your own views.
Exactly.
Just
right.
cutting it off right away.
Yeah, just assume that they're just wrong and they don't know what they're talking about. Or we can move on to derogation, where we say, well, they're just stupid, or they're backward, or whatever. And in the long haul, if we get really upset, we can start to try to destroy those people who have cultural worldviews that are different from our own. And according to terror management theory, we're doing this all in an effort just to try to protect ourselves from this potential anxiety related to death.
Okay.
So again, to sort of reiterate, so we've got the cultural worldview, we derive the self-esteem from the cultural worldview. That self-esteem is protecting us from that potential anxiety that we're aware of.
Okay.
Okay?
I have a number of questions, both out of curiosity and some out of disagreement with the theory. Not that I'm an expert on anything here, but I have a question. Is death really the worst thing that can happen to humans then, if it's the central fear that we have, or the central potential for anxiety that we have?
I do not believe it's the only potential for anxiety. I don't. To ask if it's the worst thing that can happen, certainly not. In fact, without death, life wouldn't be of much value.
Okay.
Right? That's what, if we would live forever, we wouldn't have all this gnashing of teeth about who's right and who's wrong, because we don't have that fear.
The transitoriness gives life meaning because we have to make use of our time.
Exactly.
Okay. The problem that I've heard other scientists criticize terror management theory for is exactly this question. If the central fear we have is death, then why are we willing to die for our values? And an extreme example of this would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I've heard we were literally 10 seconds away from total destruction of humanity. This implies that maybe meaning, and the meaning we have in our lives through our values and through our families and our relationships, perhaps is actually the central need for humans. Thus, perhaps the things that are worse than death are the things we fear more than death. That's my claim. What's your response to that?
What would you say that we would fear more than death? Such as?
1984.
Okay, so total control. We don't have any freedom.
A world in which nothing we want to do will be fulfilled. A world in which freedom is totally destroyed. A world in which love is impossible. You could also say Brave New World is one of those worlds where all we live for is to take soma, a super drug, and we are not out to gain any meaning in life, but only pleasure. I think humans, the reason why we fight for things and offer our lives is because we know that there are things in life that are more important than our own lives, and I think that's what we see in altruism, for example. What's your response to
Okay, let's go back a little bit here.
Okay.
So first of all, I think you're discounting a little bit our sheer will to survive.
that? Okay.
I think when you get right down to it, there are lots of people who believe they die for something, but when they're actually doing the dying, they're like going, "Wait a minute, I don't want to do this." Okay, so
Mhm.
I think we need to remember that we have this hardwired instinct for life that if we didn't have, we wouldn't be here anymore.
Mhm.
The other thing is that when you talk about dying for something, dying for an idea, we're willing to die, but what we're going after at that point is symbolic immortality. We're not talking about the face of the earth being destroyed. If you talk about going to war, for example, to maintain our values, we're not just going to war to die. It's not about us anymore. We're going to war in order that we can pass on to other people whatever freedom or whatever cultural worldview we value. So I'm not quite seeing a connection there in terms of, yes, people are running maybe to their death, but they're not just doing it because they don't want to live anymore.
Mhm.
It's because they, in my mind, they are pursuing some sort of symbolic immortality.
Okay. Well, just to pick on this altruism idea, then you have cases where individuals jump into somewhere
Sure.
they know they might die, and actually
Mhm.
it's not even cognitive. It's like an
Mhm.
instinct,
Mhm.
and they risk their lives in the instant, and
Mhm.
that's not, I believe, not for them being called uh, being praised in the
Right.
mm-hmm. subsequent to their
Mhm.
actions, but
Mhm.
it's for its own sake.
Mhm.
It's like an instinctual thing in humans that we have, and um, I see your point on the symbolic death, because that's when you expand the term death to be symbolic as well.
Mhm.
That does, you can pull in the ideas that we have in our values in that, sure, but I still think that I still think that death kind of loses its definition in that sense. Like values are.
How can death lose its definition? Death is death.
I see your point, but I mean, I think that when you expand the definition of a term, you can dilute the definition. That's my point.
Okay.
Like death, which is what our organisms strive not to
Exactly.
achieve,
Yes.
or at least try to avoid. Survival is the opposite of death.
Mhm.
And I think that if we put, and of course you're calling it symbolic death, so it's another term again.
So symbolic immortality. I'm not calling it symbolic death. Death is death.
Okay, symbolic
what you get
immortality.
from it is symbolic immortality.
Okay, so that's the result of altruism, symbolic immortality.
No, I'm not saying that either.
so
no, altruism is something altogether different. I guess maybe if you want to define altruism as I'm dying for, so that my country can go on. Does that seem like altruism to you?
That sounds like patriotism to me.
Are they different?
In a sense, but they have parallels. Certainly they do.
Yeah, I agree with you that altruism there's a selflessness involved.
I think there's an altruism for animals too. Not, animals have it as well, but also we have it for animals, like our dogs, for example. And we're not saving our dogs because, and certainly we're saving them because we don't want them to die. But I do think that the fear of death disappears in that instance when you're altruistic. And trust me, I mean, these ideas are not well developed. These are my instant reactions when I read about terror management theory yesterday. I'm merely trying to get to the bottom here of the problem, if we can. I want to go on, unless you have another.
No.
Okay. Dr. Jordan Peterson suggested, when he was talking about terror management theory, that complexity is what we fear the most. Not death, but complexity, which is why so many people, and more by the day, commit suicide, for example.
Complexity. I don't. Can you say more about what you
Yeah,
mean by
yeah.
complexity? Do you mean like meaning?
Complexity is, I mean, the complexity of being, the complexity of existence, how complex the world is.
Right.
And he says that we fear complexity because it's so challenging that if we took on the entire complexity of being, we would disintegrate in a second because it's so vast.
Right.
We are one in like almost 5 now, I think, billion people on Earth, and those are just the people. Then we have the Earth, the laws of. I mean, you see people go insane more often than we probably think of just trying to understand the whole.
Sure.
Because it's so vast.
Right.
So he thinks, and I haven't done too much investigation into this, he thinks that complexity is what we fear the most and not death.
So, excuse me, ever since terror management theory was put forth in 1986, they have been pounded with other people saying that it's other things. Okay. I was one of those people while I was working with Tom Pazinski. I made the argument that, in fact, it wasn't death at all, that, in fact, it was existential freedom, which is the problem. And to me, what you're describing as complexity is what existential freedom is to me, right? Is this the hard, it's easy to die. The hard stuff is trying to make sense and make choices every single moment of every single day.
Exactly.
And that is the problem, right? Okay, so there is a actually not very well explored field, because I started it and didn't finish the research. But if someone else wants to pick it up, it's a great place to pick up.
I'm going to be first in line.
Okay. And then there were another team of researchers, primarily from Canada, who were making the argument that, in fact, the issue was meaning. It wasn't death. It was this making of meaning. So to me, it sounds like when you talk about complexity, this is sort of folding together these two existential issues of freedom and meaning, right? So in answer to what was his name,
Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Dr. Peterson's, I would agree with him. And I think that anyone studying terror management would agree. And that is something they are still trying to figure out, is to figure out the exact mechanism.
Okay.
Right? So, yeah.
Yes, just to kind of explore these ideas that you put forth. So existential freedom, to me, you could say insinuates that there, in its sense, that means that everything works. The existential freedom, everything works if you have existential freedom.
It works. What do you mean that it works?
Like anything goes. Like it's free for all.
Yes, it is a free for all.
But meaning, on the other hand, comes through values, through love, through actions, and through attitudes. So beliefs.
Which is part of that cultural worldview.
Exactly.
As well.
Exactly. And the thing is, the world of facts, the world of truths and of objects, as we mentioned, is so vast that it's hard for a human living 100 years or 80 years, which is more accurate when it comes to the average statistics, will never be able to understand all of this. So he needs to cope through a structure, which is a priori in a sense, because it lives through our history, and our history lives in us all the time. We would be lost without it, and we are kind of lost today, actually, because a lot of people don't know anything about history. So I think this topic is extremely interesting, because we find meaning through, you could say, experience and ideas.
Yes, I would say the meaning starts, though, with socialization. Your cultural worldview begins being formed as soon as you pop out of the womb and you start to encounter an immediate family doing something around you, traditions, values, beliefs. You find yourself embedded in this larger society and culture that has its own beliefs. So to me, yes, you can build your cultural worldview through experience, but I think a lot of it we get passively.
It's passed down from the generations.
It's passed around from Yes, from the media, from our families, from our culture. Yeah, and we're more of a passive sort of receptacle that this information is just sort of being dumped into.
Mm-hmm.
And it's filling us up, right? Because we need to be filled up, because we need the meaning, or the whatever, okay? If we want to say we need the meaning to give our life meaning, or we need the cultural worldview to buffer us from death, right? So this is where it starts to fall apart a little bit, right? Because we can start saying, well, we can all agree there's a cultural worldview, but what exactly is it doing?
That's it, right?
Right.
And what is it? Because
Right.
some people
Well,
would say it's just
completely individual for each person.
And some people would say it's an ideology, but I wouldn't describe a religion as an ideology, for example. I would describe, I've heard ideologies described as warped and bent and twisted religions. So incomplete religions. I want to answer this.
Certainly, religion is a part of everyone's cultural worldview.
That's true. So the worldview is kind of like this giant box in which we can put ideologies, in which we can put single ideas or memes, which we will follow on to talk about later, but also religions and practices and experiences and just conventions in society in general, you could say. So the worldview is the wide term.
Yes.
But in therein we have different things, and we need to distinguish between them. And I want to ask you here, do you think that we can make our own values? This is a deep topic, certainly, but just briefly, do you think we can make our own values as individuals?
Yes.
Okay. How?
I mean, so first you have to start with making an assumption about whether or not you believe humans are basically good or basically bad.
Okay.
If you think that they're basically bad, that they can't manage themselves, then you will certainly believe that we can't make our own values. However, if you say humans are basically good, then why wouldn't they be capable of making their own values?
Because we don't have control of ourselves. We can like complete control. What I think, well, my take on it, I understand from you that if humans are good, as in the opposite of evil,
right? Which I do not like even going down that path.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Because a lot of the evil things that we do are considered evil because someone said they were evil rather than they're really being evil, and they're oftentimes caused not by people's characters or personalities, but because of the situation they're in. But okay, I'm sorry, I'm probably muddying up the waters here.
Well, we can follow up on that if you'd like.
No. So where were you going? I'm sorry.
No, I don't think, I believe that the arena between good and evil, which would be just to use the traditional terms, is our hearts. So that's the arena. So I think we're both good and bad, and you see this in how fragile civilization is, how Germany went from being a decent and conscientious people to degenerating into an insane tyranny.
Right.
Never manifested before. It was so unprecedented. It shocked every living human being, and even people in Germany didn't believe how. Some of them didn't. Many of them did, probably more than what a lot of people are willing to admit. But some of them didn't even. They couldn't even fathom how extreme this tyranny was. So I think we're capable of committing both evil and good actions. But I don't think that we can form our own values, because I think our values are deeply embodied in us, and I think we live out our values throughout our lives. And I think
deeply embodied in us. How do they get there?
Archetypes. I think they lie in the archetypes.
Okay.
And we, if you want, we can come back to this later, or we can go down this road now.
Whatever suits you.
Okay. Well, since we entered the realm of archetypes, I should explain what it is first for the listeners. So there's this, you could say, competition between the ideas of memes, which are the basic units of cultural information, like a gene, but just in the culture. So it's like an idea fighting competing in the pool of ideas. That's a meme, one idea. But, and this was proposed by Richard Dawkins in, I believe, the 70s, if not the 80s. I think it was the 70s. Regardless, the other idea, which is older, is the Jungian archetypes. An archetype is, well, I should take a step back. I should explain a little bit what Jung thinks. So Jung, he believes that like our bodies have organs, our mind and our psyche, and not just our brain, but like our consciousness has organs. Not the same organs like a heart or lungs, but organs nevertheless, systems in our consciousness. And he believes that all humans have a collective unconscious. So the unconscious is what we do not think about, but what we live out and what drives us. And he believes that archetypes are units of this collective unconscious. And an example of an archetype is, and we find these archetypes through stories and narratives. So they're not like drives, like Freud is talking about. They're not like the pleasure principle, or the death drive, which we can talk about later in relation to terror management. They're stronger. They're not from behind and to. They're pulling you towards it. That's the archetypal idea. They're like electromagnetic fields. I think that we live out, and this is based mainly on Dr. Jordan Peterson's theory, which is again based on the Jungian theory, that we live out a story. Every human lives out his story, and we pick our story to a certain degree, but we don't pick the values. I think the values are there. So freedom of speech is a value that we can't just like reform. It's always going to be a value. The hero archetype, which is Frodo in the Lord of the Rings, which is Harry Potter and the Harry Potter series. We know he's the hero without saying he is. You can tell. It's an archetype. Kids know it. They don't have to be told. It's not a construction of society. They know it's a hero. They can tell, and they have done studies. I'm not sure you're aware of this. They have done studies where they show that infants can tell the difference between an authoritarian parent and a non-authoritarian parent. So kids, they can feel if they're encountering the tyrannical father or the good father, the tyrannical mother or the good mother, which also are archetypes. Deeply embodied understandings of human nature, I would say, and of the world. So this is extremely complex. I'm definitely not 100% convinced of this, but I certainly feel like this is right, that we live out our stories. So what's your response to this?
I have a question.
Okay.
What do you mean when you say we don't pick our values?
I'm not saying we don't pick them. I'm saying we can't make them. We pick what's there, like an a la carte. Like we pick what there is to pick.
Okay.
But,
I misunderstood you then,
okay.
Because I heard you say that we don't pick the
I
values.
might have said that, but I meant at least that we can choose between Christianity and Islam.
Yes.
Which are value systems, belief systems. We can choose between capitalism and communism, which are also, you could say, less convincing belief systems in a sense, but also way more shallow belief systems than religions are. We can choose which systems we want, but we can't just make up new values and expect that they count for other people as well. Like I can make up my own value for myself, but I can't expect that to work on a social scale. That's at least my view. That's why you see very few people are still convinced that the Enlightenment is the right way deep in their hearts, because they're way more driven by their emotions than rationality, for example. So the Enlightenment is a value system. It just doesn't pertain to everyone because it's not as deep. It doesn't reach into the depths of our being and convince us that it's right. It sounds extremely right to our reason, like every human being is endowed with unalienable rights. Like that's a great phrase. It's just that we're so easily convinced, on the other hand, that, well, maybe we aren't. We have owned slaves. We do this. We do that. We throw people in jail now in certain countries, even in Britain, for telling jokes. So I don't think that we can construct values that will hold over such a long period as Christianity has, for example.
Wow, lots of stuff going on here. Okay, first of all, I will agree with you that that there are really no more new values to make. Okay, all the values that ever are going to be are out there, whatever they are. Okay, and when I say values, honesty is a value, trust is a value. Okay, so we've got all these values. But having said that, and I like a lot your sort of metaphor of it being sort of like a buffet, right? You've got all your values out there. You can walk down the line and you can pick up this value or that value, or leave this value laying and not take that. So I'm all good with that. But where I stumble into trouble is when we start talking about right values and wrong values. Okay. Because this is where we are now in moral judgment land, where we are saying, well, we don't value, for example, eating humans after they die because that sounds gross, but for another culture or tribe or situation, that value might be useful, right? I don't know. I know that's really like a bizarre sort of example.
Just quickly on that. When I said it's like a buffet, I just to be clear, I did not mean that the hierarchy is like a buffet.
I realize that. I recognize that.
I still believe that there's a hierarchy of values, that some work better than others.
You think that, yes.
Yes, I think that.
Okay.
But
you recognize other people might think a different hierarchy is better. Okay.
But I would also argue that we can prove that some values work better than others.
Prove? That's a big word.
Well, I think we can prove that honesty works better than lying, for example. Because societies based on trust are much more successful than those based on tyranny and lies, and that's really what we've seen in the 20th century with how Solzhenitsyn puts this pretty simply, like the reason why Russia fell into a tyranny and became the Soviet Union was because people were willing to do what they knew to be wrong and lie about everything. So he blamed himself for having believed what the leaders put forth and what the ideology promised to do for the country.
So someone along the way decided they didn't want to value honesty and trust anymore.
And the people did, because it's not top down, it's bottom up. The people put themselves in a trap, you could say, by being able and allowing themselves to lie. So the society became engulfed in lies.
Okay. Keep talking.
Well, so I believe that, just before you go on, that we can and we have to judge some values higher than others. We have to. And we do that all the time. That's why you pick
We do it all the time, but I don't know that it's always right to do that all the time.
Oh, well, our judgments could be wrong, but I do believe we choose the values that work the best for us.
And when you say the values that work best for us, again, what do you mean by us? Do you mean us as a society? Do you mean us as individuals? Do you mean us as members of our solar system? I mean, this is the thing. When we start talking about values that are best for us, well, again, I don't know if you're on an individual level, it's difficult.
Let me give an example. So in Saudi Arabia, they stone homosexuals for being homosexual. That's a value they have. In the West, we don't do that. And I would submit that although that society thinks that's useful for them, it's not useful for anyone, and it's wicked, and it's malevolent. While in the West, we're civil enough, at least for a couple hundred years we have been, or not even that long necessarily, but long enough to see the differences between our values and other values, and we have to distinguish between those. The same goes for North Korean freedom of speech compared to Western freedom of speech. I would submit that our idea of freedom of speech is much better than Kim Jong-un saying, okay, your entire family is sentenced to a prison sentence because you said a few things that you shouldn't have said about the leader of the country. So I believe that unconsciously or consciously, we always determine what values are better than others. Always, all the time. And you're right, they can be wrong subjectively, but on a larger scale, we can see what works, what's pragmatic for our society.
For society, yes. For our society,
yeah,
yes.
In general, yeah.
But do you think Kim Jong-un doesn't believe he has any values?
No, he probably does.
He does. And that is the only point I'm trying to make, is I'm sure that he thinks what he's doing for some reason that he values. And for all we know, and I don't know anything about it, but for all we know, the people in his country might appreciate those values.
I read a book called Our Culture, What's Left of It, where the author Theodore Dalrymple went to North Korea, and one of the people came up to him and he asked him, which is illegal actually for inhabitants of North Korea. They're usually starved and in immense malnutrition, and they can't talk to strangers, foreigners, when they visit, because they have to have guides all the time, so they can only show them the good parts. So the man said to him, do you speak English? And he answered yes. And then the man said, I'm studying literature, and reading Shakespeare is the greatest pleasure of my life. He corrected himself and said, no, it's the only pleasure of my life. I believe that no one can honestly think that the North Korean system is better than the Western system.
I don't know, because I'm not everyone else.
Sure.
We are limited by our own cultural worldview,
and of course,
our own upbringing, our own experiences growing up. We would also all probably say that capitalism is better than communism. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it is now, maybe it won't be down the road. I think I'm just trying to get at anytime we start categorizing and pigeonholing and saying that this value is more important than this value, and I agree, there's probably some truth, some probably are, but we go down a slippery slope where we're saying some people's values are better than others. And who's to say that? Who's to determine whether, yes, we can sit here and conjecture that yes, the person whose only joy in life is to read Shakespeare, and we can say, oh gosh, yeah, that's meaningful, but we're not them, and we're not in their shoes, and I'm not comfortable with conversations in which we, again, start to say this value is good and this value is bad.
Okay, I want to give another example here just to see if that might lay out my own argument better than if I just answered with an argument. So, okay, so the same author, he's a psychiatrist in England. He's been working in the lower quality neighborhoods, you could say, among the underclass. And that's where you see these ideas that we shouldn't judge values. That's where he sees how damaging those ideas are. Because those people, they have come to believe, not according to, but based on what they've heard the intelligentsia say for the latter half of the century, in the 20th century, and also in the 21st century, how they're saying, well, morality is a field where everything, all the multiculturalism, for example, means that we shouldn't judge other cultures because they're just other systems and they're just other people. and thus they're just as valuable as we are. Their values are just as valuable as we are. I would say that as humans, they are as valuable as us, definitely, because we're all human and we have our experiences, and they're valuable. We have to believe that to value humans at all. But I don't think that that values have equal value. Like that doesn't make sense to me, because there's a reason why they're coming to the West, and we're not moving down to Africa. There's a reason. There's a good reason that has to do with how our civilization works. So he's
how
saying
they perceive it works.
That's fine, but we also know it works better when we look at measurements of health, of how literacy and everything like that.
Maybe health and literacy. The U.S. is not at the top of the pile in terms of life expectancy and health. Or literacy, for that matter.
Okay, but also things like freedom of speech and
see,
protection
now
from
we're
the law
changing,
and everything.
right? Now we keep changing the measuring stick. We're measuring in terms of health. Now we're measuring in terms of literacy. So this is the trouble too, because different values track on to different measurements.
Okay.
How are we going to measure what's good? Yeah. And
it is a deep question, certainly.
Right.
But I just want to finish this example here, and if you would follow it up, then that's good. But if not, we can go on to talk about filter bubbles and such, because we also have that on our timetable today. So he sees how these members of the underclass live out these values. So they believe that they're not responsible for being where they are at all. They when they talk about how they stabbed their friend or whatever, they say the knife went in, not that I stabbed them. They say the knife went in. The heroin went mad. My head went mad. It's never them, because they're not responsible for the values, and the values are just as good. And they also believe that because their way of life doesn't matter, because whatever works, they also think that it's the psychiatrist's job to make them healthy and not their own job. They don't think that they play a part by the way they act, by what they live out. So, for example, wanting to look nice and not have a million tattoos will make you look more presentable among others, and it will make you look as if you care about yourself and about other people, because you look presentable and you look good, and you take care of yourself, and that means that you're probably going to take care of other people as well. So there's a massive difference between that and not showering at all, for example, not doing anything to make you look presentable. So when they come to him and they say, well, help me give me some medicine, the first thing he says that the therapist should do is to disavow his responsibility for the patient. He should say right away that you are the one who needs to work on yourself. I'll help you, but you have to be willing to concede that maybe the way you're living isn't right. Maybe your values are not the right values. Maybe taking drugs is not a better value than not taking drugs. Right? So I think that although it's hard to measure it scientifically, we can tell that it's better to act in a way that allows you to be healthy and allows you to stay out of jail for saying what you're supposed to say is better than not doing that and getting in jail and stuff like that. That's really my point here. Like, there is a hierarchy of values, and we need it in society for civilization to remain intact. That's my argument.
I respectfully disagree.
Why?
Well, again, I feel as though this whole idea, let's just take, for example, looking presentable. What is that? Who cares if you have tattoos over your body? You know who cares? People who think you shouldn't have tattoos on your body care. What about people who think you should have tattoos on your body? There are a group of people out there probably like that, who think that they're beautiful, wonderful, creative, fabulous things. So again, I'm not comfortable.
I should probably correct myself on that one.
Okay.
Because the only reason why I mentioned this is because he noted, as having worked in a prison for a long time, how the correlation between having tattoos that say "fuck the police" and "fuck you" are very highly correlated with violent men.
Oh, really? Yeah,
Yeah.
of course they are.
Like that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm not talking about any beautiful tattoo. So I should.
But still, when you start using terminology like looking presentable,
Well, it's like saying, it's like making a statement though. Putting a statement on your skin. It's the same as putting it out there in general, but permanently.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I'm not saying that people shouldn't be able to have tattoos. Obviously they should, and I don't have a problem with that. My father has many tattoos, and they're really nice. I have wanted to have a tattoo for a long time, but I'm just saying that there's a difference between having a spider in your face and looking different than if you don't have a spider in your face tattooed onto your face. Like we make value judgments. Maybe we're not willing to concede it, but we do it unconsciously no matter what.
No, we do.
If
and I'm trying to argue that we need to do it less.
So you don't think that if someone has "fuck the police" on his forehead, he shouldn't be judged by an employer as perhaps not as stable as someone who does not have "fuck the police" in his forehead and who wears a suit instead of like saggy clothes and not looking as if he cares about himself at all?
I'm saying in our society, yes, that is important. Because that's what we value. We think that in order to do a good job, we shouldn't have tattoos. We should wear suits. We shouldn't say "fuck the police." But again, don't you think there are people out there that have tattoos? Maybe they got tattoos a long time ago that say "fuck the police,"
Mm-hmm.
and now they're sorry they got them, and they're just looking for another opportunity to adopt new values.
And that's fine. And
yet
but then
here we are saying, well, they're not presentable. They're not this. They're not that. We're making judgments that prevent us from seeing who they really are.
And that's fine, but then they might be willing to explain that in the interview. And also, there are as many tattoo removal shops today, I think, or actually, if it's not 2 for every 1, so as there are tattoo shops at all. So it's very popular to remove your tattoo. So certainly, yes.
Right. I think we're off on a tangent about tattoos that I don't really care about tattoos.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
We were just talking as an example of
this
idea of looking
mm-hmm.
presentable.
Okay.
And looking presentable is determined by a culture,
mm-hmm.
and a culture, and there are subgroups in that culture who can either say, yes, I want to look presentable. But there are other people in that subculture that as a way to say "fuck the police" to the culture says, I'm not gonna wear nice clothes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is what the hippies did in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. That's what they did.
They saw all of these, buttoned up
mm-hmm.
Businessmen with their suits and said, well, that's just ridiculous. I'm gonna wear my bell-bottom jeans and my tube tops, and I'm gonna show lots of skin. Were they not presentable anymore?
I don't think they were as presentable as someone who wears a suit. I don't think so.
Okay. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Then we're going to have to agree to disagree on this one.
But
it's good.
But just before we move on,
mm-hmm.
and we could certainly pick this up another time if you're willing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the reasons why I feel so deeply about looking presentable is because we as a society and we as people have strived to overcome the suffering of life all throughout time. And we have achieved that today in our society to a large extent. Of course, we still have suffering, but we have electricity, we have hot water, we have everything we need, materially speaking,
mm-hmm.
Which does make us poorer spiritually speaking. Mm-hmm. But the same author, again, I keep bringing him up, but he is really admirable. He worked in like a lot on all continents in the world. He worked in Africa, and he noted how he saw the difference when the citizens of Africa who don't have any material goods,
mm-hmm.
how they cared about how they looked,
mm-hmm.
how they washed their uniforms, mm-hmm. how they made sure that they looked presentable, because that was important to them. Mm-hmm. And I realized there's a difference.
It's dignity.
It's dignity, exactly. It's respect for yourself and respect for other people. Not like, you can tell the difference between someone who never washes their clothes and someone who does. Mm-hmm. By the fact that they're showing they care about, I would say, themselves, but mm-hmm. thus about other people too, mm-hmm. about humans in general. Which is why I believe that we have turning that around is fine, and it obviously should be and is mm-hmm. legal, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's a good judgment still, and I think if we look presentable, that is much better than if we don't look presentable. Just because.
Much better. For what? It's better for what?
For showing dignity.
For showing dignity.
For showing that you care.
If that's how you derive your dignity.
Of course, there are several ways, but it's a part of it.
I still feel as though there is a tendency here to want to push your values onto other people. Let me tell you a story. Can I tell a story?
Sure.
It has to do with terror management theory.
Okay.
Okay?
Great.
Terror management theory. I first heard about it in St. Louis. I heard that one of the creators of terror management theory was going to be giving a lecture at St. Louis University. I was very excited because I was thinking, I want to go work with these people, right? And I actually get to meet one of them. And I go to this classroom at Wash U, or St. Louis U, and I'm late. I'm realizing, oh no, I've like got a half hour off. And I walk into this classroom, and there are these students sitting around, and there's this man standing at the front, and he's talking, and I'm saying to myself, well, geez, who the hell was that? I guess it didn't start yet, because I don't know. This man is wearing a tie-dye t-shirt, cargo pants, work boots, lace-up work boots. He has hair down to his shoulders. I have no idea if he had bathed recently or not. He didn't smell bad, but he did not look professional, and he certainly did not look professorial, okay? I could have turned around and said, oh, well, I'm either in the wrong place, but then I started listening to him and realized that the brilliant brain inside of this slobby body, this slobby clothing, was Sheldon Solomon. And he's the brain behind terror management theory, right? So what happens when I start making a judgment about him and his theory because he's wearing tie-dye clothing and cargo pads? Because he certainly didn't look presentable, as we would consider him to look presentable, to be talking to a lot of students about his highfalutin theory, right? But, so what do you do with that information?
Well, what I would do with that is say that I don't think that how we present ourselves determine our entire value. It's one value.
But you are making it sound as though we can judge people based on how presentable they look.
I'm not, but I'm not saying we shouldn't respect them. I'm saying that it has to do with a love of humanity and not of. I certainly understand your point. I mean, obviously, a great brain is a great brain, no matter what clothes the great brain is wearing. Certainly. That does not, however, mean that works for everyone. I mean, he probably didn't look that way when he had his job interview, or
I almost guarantee he probably did.
He might have.
I have never seen him at a conference.
Okay.
I have never seen him anywhere. At a professional conference presenting, he looks exactly the same.
Okay. Well, I mean.
And he is in an environment in academia where there's a lot more flexibility around those things. They're willing to realize, oh, maybe he doesn't look great, maybe he doesn't have a suit on, but in academia, we don't care what people look like. We care what's in their heads. We care how much research grant money they can bring in. We care how well they can teach classes. We don't care what they look like. So this is, again, the point is, as we move from even within our own culture, from industry to industry, and then we start moving out to other cultures, having a value about how someone presents themselves starts to sort of fall apart for me.
Okay, but of course it's different when it's someone who you know is professional than if it's someone in a dark street at night who is walking with a suit and obviously no spiders in their faces or fuck the coppers in their faces, and someone who is walking around looking pretty dangerous.
I don't know. The guy in the suit would scare me more. If he's walking around at midnight, what the hell is he doing out there?
He's doing business.
He's doing business. Yes, he is.
Well, that's different from, it's just we maybe it's easier to denounce it, but I think that's how we feel in the moment all the time.
That's how you feel in the moment. I don't think everyone feels that way in the moment. I think it depends completely on their past experiences how they grew up, where they grew up, whether they grew up fairly wealthy, entitled, or white, or whether they grew up a person of color in a poverty-ridden area. I mean, all of these things color how we perceive other people. There's no one standard. That's what I'm arguing. There's no one standard to here's a person with all the values that we're looking for, right? And like, it depends what values you're looking for, depending on who you are and what you need that person for.
Okay.
So yes.
All right.
We're still agreeing to disagree. I believe.
Perhaps. Perhaps we'll pick it up another time.
Mm-hmm.
I want to take us into a different field here now. Totally, completely different.
All right.
The reason I'm doing this project in the first place is kind of well, there are several reasons, but one of them is that today the individual has broadcasting power. I can make a video and talk to a professor like yourself, and 100 people will see it.
Mm-hmm.
That would never happen if we sat here without microphones and talked.
That's correct.
That wouldn't happen without Facebook, blah, blah, social media and general technology. This fact of having individual broadcasting power has led to another phenomenon, which is an old phenomenon, but it has amplified it, rather, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So tribalism has become filter bubbles and echo chambers online today. We are going to talk about this a little bit. So if you would lay out what the problem of a filter bubble is, and echo chambers, and group polarization, how it affects our society.
All right, where to start? I think we can sort of go back to terror management here for a second, and talk about this idea of a cultural worldview. And the term tribalism in and of itself implies a group or tribe of people who have their own unique set of beliefs. Am I interpreting that correctly when we hear the word tribalism?
I would say so.
You're hanging out with your own group who shares the values that you share, who follows the customs that you follow, who defines, let's say, success in the same way you do. All of these things, right?
That's tribe, yes.
So tribalism,
or a group, you could just call it.
Yes, yeah. So they're a group of people with a shared cultural worldview.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can group by
well, and today we also say shared color of skin, shared sex sometimes as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't particularly find group identity useful at all in general for addressing an individual. So just to make the point, like, I don't think just because you're wearing a certain clothing doesn't mean you're part of a group. It means you're an individual who chooses to do something which I wouldn't choose to do. So, but without going back to that, so go on.
Okay. So no, and I agree. So we're in agreement here that a tribe is a group of like-minded people that sort of agree on something.
Familiarities.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So, where to go?
How does it affect society? Yes.
So it's natural. If whichever version of terror management that we believe, whether it's buffering against death, or it's providing us with meaning, or it's quelling our fears about existential freedom, okay, having a cultural worldview and people around you who agree with that validates your cultural worldview, right? You like to be surrounded by people who believe what you believe, because then you're like, okay, I'm on the right track. I've got to just follow the rules of the culture and I'm good.
You're safe and sound.
You're safe and sound. So, and again, this is a lot of what the terror management research was looking at, is what happens when we bump into people who don't agree with us, okay? If you're a Christian and you run into Muslims, this completely sort of rattles your cultural worldview, because it's there are lots of things in common between Christianity and Islam, but there are lots of things that are not, which is why we got so upset after 9/11, right? It's like it's a whole other religion. Sorry, I'm sort of going off on a tangent here.
For sure.
So if you buy into this idea of terror management theory and these cultural worldviews, and that they are functioning to do something, okay, like I said, whether it's buffering us from death, or have a purpose, or boosting our self-esteem, we already now have a built-in motivation to stick with people who believe what we believe.
Mm-hmm. It's safety, right?
Right. It's safety, right? So we've got that going on. It's natural. It's people don't like it, and now then thanks to the media that you were just talking about before, is now we don't even have to listen to anyone else if we don't want to,
Mm-hmm.
right? Back in the the 60s, 70s, news. There were 3 or 4 news networks, and they were all reporting in a very neutral way just what was going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you would hear things every night on the nightly news where you could go, well, that's not right. I hate that. I think that's wrong, right? People would scream at their televisions, and they'd scream at one another about what they were saying on television, okay? But it was a good thing, right? Because you were exposed to all sides.
Mm-hmm.
So now that makes us very uncomfortable, right? According to all the theorizing we're talking about. Well, how great if I can just tune into that station that's just saying all the stuff that I believe,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And if they're constantly saying all that stuff I believe, I can feel confident. I've got the right worldview. I'm doing all the things I need to do so that I can be successful in my worldview, and I can buffer all of that anxiety about whatever existential angst I have. So it shouldn't be surprising to us. It's a very natural place to end up, and the
Too
fact,
natural, maybe.
yeah, scary natural,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't know quite how we get out of it, short of what we're doing here,
Yes.
right?
Short of dialogue.
Yeah, yeah, or being able to open yourself up to listening to things that you're not going to like.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people that do that. In one of my exercises in my social psych class, I asked people to think about if and when they actually step outside their filter bubble.
Sure.
And the large majority were quick to admit, like, no, I don't.
Not really.
No, I don't.
No.
I don't like it. And some people say, sometimes I'll listen to if I'm liberal, I'll purposely listen to Fox News just to hear what they're
Mm-hmm.
saying, or vice versa.
Yes.
But there, some people said, sometimes I'll sit down with a group of students at lunch that I normally wouldn't have lunch with. But by and large, it's too easy.
Yeah.
It is too easy to just stick in our own little bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have the additional problem of Google, who knows what you're looking at online all the time. I don't remember the fellow's name. There's a TED Talk that I show in my class who illustrated that if, for example, an Arab American and a European American go on to Google and type in the word Israel, the information that comes up for the Arab American is completely different,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now the search engines are in on it. They know what they think we want to see. And even if you're curious, I want to know what's going on in Israel. They're not telling you some neutral story about what's going on in Israel. They're telling you what you think you want to know about what's going on in Israel.
Yeah.
So it's getting more and more frightening all the time, because even if we want to learn something about, I don't know, the Middle East, okay, we can't even trust Google to give us the right information.
Yes.
or the accurate
Mm-hmm.
information. So again, and we know from studies in social psychology, there's this you mentioned group polarization.
Yes.
Right? And we know this happens. We know that when like-minded people sit in a group and talk amongst themselves about what they believe, they become even more rigid
Mm-hmm.
in that belief.
Yes.
And even when we sometimes talk to people that disagree with us, sometimes that can make us more rigid, because
sure.
we just kind of
Depends on how they do it, actually.
Yeah.
Like, for example, like we're doing now, I'm laying out my arguments,
Mm-hmm.
and you give me enough time,
Mhm.
and then you're laying out your arguments, and we're reviewing them.
right.
So, hence, you're not going to necessarily get more rigid in your views. You might, and I might do the same.
Right.
But there's a larger chance that because we are having the spirit of dialectic, like
Right.
Plato
Sure.
loved, and you could say even made, we're much more likely to not just retreat into
Right.
our filter, but like we
Right.
get a taste of the other side,
Right.
and you realize,
Right.
well, maybe our arguments here aren't as strong as they should be,
Right.
and I need to talk to him or her more about this topic so that I can make my argument stronger, or actually so that I can think more clearly
Right.
about this topic,
Right.
which really is the purpose of having a dialogue and putting yourself in such a situation where you're questioned and where you question others. I want to bring a little light, you could say, into this dark picture of constant polarization. There is a phenomenon going on, and ironically, the name of this phenomenon is called the intellectual dark web. So even though it's I would say a beacon of light, the name is ironically contradicting that. This is actually a phenomenon of long form conversation online. You have people like the greatest podcaster there is, not quality, but in quantity and downloads and stuff. Joe Rogan. You also have YouTubers. This is mainly going on YouTube, but also on podcast apps, and they also have Twitter and Facebook, all that stuff. But the videos are usually posted on YouTube. So you have Dave Rubin. He has like a talk show, like an hour long conversations. Joe Rogan has 3 hour long conversations on average. Jordan Peterson puts his lectures on YouTube, and millions of people watch him talk about like biblical values and psychological interpretations of the Bible, but also of just Jung and Freud, and like it's great that it's so popular. So now they're saying, Joe Rogan said himself that he has so many million downloads a week or a month that it's like higher than many of the traditional media now. So this shows that people are willing to tune in to long form conversations where they are challenged, where they have to review their own interpretations. But this phenomenon might not be as wide as it should be, and it might jump back, and I don't know. But it's better than going on CNN and Fox and and respectively. Just if that's your channel, you go on there and that's all you hear. You'll only hear CNN's view. Another point here, which I would like to make, is that when they have this competition, the traditional media, according to tournament theory, I believe it's called, they become more willing to take risks, which is the phenomenon of fake news. They are willing to risk journalistic integrity for views, for staying popular, for having influence, which is problematic. And this accounts this tournament theory also accounts for things like in sports, for example, if you're down 2-0 in soccer, you're more likely to take risks because you have to make those 2 goals or 3 to win, to tie it, but you can't lose and you have to risk it. So this happens in the sphere of media too, in the domain of ideas.
Yes.
So that, I think that is a good thing. Challenging the filter bubbles, opening up for long-term conversation, because we have kind of been trapped in this like 7-minute on-air TV talks, like the shit talking on TV that you see between whoever it is, like Trump or Hillary or whatever, like whatever it is on CNN. You see 2 opposing guests. All they do is to try to make the other guy look bad, not to talk about his own arguments. And this happens in our political dialogues too, which I wouldn't even call dialogues anymore.
And that's been going on though for hundreds of years.
Oh, it has been going on for a long time.
Yes, where
it has
the muckraking and
sure.
Yeah,
that's an older phenomenon.
Yes, it's a very
But it's worse today, I would say, based on how easily it's spread.
Yes, because of how easily it's spread. I think I don't know if it's happening necessarily that much more often. It's just we are aware that it's happening every time it happens.
But it becomes entertainment too. Like people are so entertained by Trump.
Yes, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
What about this idea the journalists are kind of kicking around this idea of, what's the word? Shutting down Trump. Not reporting on him anymore. What's the word I'm after?
Oh, suppressing?
Suppressing. Nah, but just
Is it kind of like ignoring?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, they're kicking around this idea that maybe we shouldn't just talk about we shouldn't talk about him anymore.
That
Because-
sounds like it's based on the idea of all what could you say? All representation is good representation. Like all coverage is good coverage. While it would certainly give us. Well, it depends on what you mean by covering him. If it's covering what he says on Twitter, I would say that might be useful, because maybe he wouldn't make as many Twitter comments as he has.
Right.
But if it's talking about like what he does for the country, that becomes dangerous, because then we're not as involved in what's going on anymore.
And that's the catch-22 for journalists, is that that's their job, is to tell us what is going on.
So it loses its meaning.
Right, but if everything that's going on just seems like a crazy circus, then maybe the coverage should stop. And I don't think there is a good answer to this. I mean,
no. I agree.
Because it's their purpose to report what they see, and regardless of how ridiculous it may seem to viewers. So I'm thinking back to this idea you're talking about taking risks.
Yes.
Would that be risky to just shut down?
Maybe too risky.
Yeah.
Maybe too risky.
Right? And then where would the ratings come from?
Maybe that would cost them everything.
Yeah. Maybe it would. I don't know the answer to this.
Some of the members of the intellectual dark web, which is really like, it's kind of like a fun term. It's not really like an organization.
Right.
But some of those people, they're actually projecting that the traditional media, they will die. They can't survive in this new competition.
Right.
Because it's too, they're not, first of all, they're probably not funded enough to take their time and write really great stories. And they have so much competition that they're just drowning in irrelevance, which is exactly what Aldous Huxley feared writing Brave New World, that we would drown in a sea of irrelevance. So what Trump says on Twitter doesn't have to be trivial, but it usually probably is a little trivial, and that's what Twitter lets us do. I mean, it lets everyone say stupid shit, and that's what we do. But that idea, though, it's a really interesting idea, and I'm not equating Trump to the example I'm offering as an analogy, because I'm not sure he's so horrible as people say he is. I don't think he's that horrible. Of course, this moral character can be debated, certainly, and I'm willing to concede most of the bad things, but not all. And he's not. I don't think he's a racist, for example. But we're not discussing Trump today. I don't think he's ever, in the 40 whatever years he's been in the public eye, he's never said anything racist, as far as I'm concerned. But nevertheless, this ignoring idea is actually what they're talking about doing with mass murderers too, and school shooters. And again, not equating them with Trump, but it's the same idea that they want to, because
they're looking for attention.
They're looking for attention, and they're actually competing with other murderers to kill as many people, which is horrifying. So that idea could work in that sense, because then they wouldn't get any attention for doing what they perceive to be a good thing.
But then we wouldn't know.
Well, we could say murderer did this, but we wouldn't know his name. It's more the name. It's more the name, actually. Yeah.
Right.
So of course, I mean, in a similar sense, they could probably focus less on Trump's Twitter and say, well, the administration started this, and not just Trump did this and Trump responsible for the forest fires or whatever. Like that's cheap. And I haven't looked into this issue, so.
I'm not aware that anyone ever said Trump was responsible for the forest fires. I don't know where you're getting your news.
Okay, so I heard this from people instead of news, because I don't watch CNN and stuff like that. Okay. Regardless, I don't want to go down that road because I'm not not informed.
No.
Well, I guess we've kind of answered this question, but it's like, what role does tribalism play in echo chambers? So, I mean, it's pretty simple, really. It's just we have a natural tendency to form groups.
Well, to form groups that echo what we want to hear. We want our worldviews continually validated. Because if they're not validated,
societies don't work when there's a sea of irrelevance. I would say, which, I mean, could take us back to the whole value argument again. We need the same values in a sense. So, but anyways, we won't go down that road. Then we'll move on a little bit. What do you think is the role of religion in how tribalism works and how people split into groups?
Well, much like what I said about the cultural worldview, religion is usually socialized. We learn our religion from our family, from our culture.
Yes.
And it to me, just becomes part of the cultural worldview. I don't think there's anything special about religion. Well, one thing that is special about religion is most religions do allow for some route to immortality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in that sense,
and comfort as well.
Well, exactly. In my mind, religion was created for the sole purpose of quelling all of the existential anxiety. Right? Mm-hmm. It gives meaning. So if we assume there's four main issues associated with existential problems: freedom, death, meaninglessness, and isolation. Religion does a fabulous job of taking care of every one of those. It gives us a meaning system. It helps us with our freedom. It tells us what we should do and what we shouldn't do. It helps with isolation. We're part of something larger. We're part of a community where we've got this spiritual relationship with some sort of God.
Transcendent.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And meaning, and then death. Right, providing this route to immortality, and many times literal immortality. But certainly, if not literal, then symbolic immortality. So, in that sense, when you ask about the role of religion in tribalism, to me, it's just another part of the worldview that the tribe adopts.
So tribalism, you would argue, is deeper than religion. Like our propensity to split into groups,
wider.
It's not kindled by religion, but enforced perhaps by them. Like it
can be.
It can. Yeah. Well, it is when you look at, for example, like the Hindus and the Muslims in India and Pakistan. Like they have millions of people, right? And also the Catholics and the Protestants. Like people care about their differences.
Sure.
But the reason I asked actually is because I've heard I used to be really anti-theist. I'm not anymore. I used to listen to Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens talk about how religions are poisonous and how all they do is bad. But I don't think that's the case anymore at all. Like I really don't. I see how when you have one group you exclude everyone else. But I mean, I don't think that claim holds anymore. I see how jihad is not good for the world, for example. But I think that's an underlying feature of tribalism. I think it's because we are tribal, not because we're religious, that we do things. Religions are more like soft overlays on tribalism, and I'm not saying that exhausts their definition, certainly not. But that's at least the part they play in tribalism and splitting of groups, I think.
Yes.
That's at least my view. But I find this idea very interesting of symbolic immortality and literal immortality. So I think maybe I'm getting these terms not completely wrong, but a little confused. But I think I suggested, I'm not sure you caught it in the last podcast we had, that there are two ways to see the world. Or you can see the world as if it has two realities. And I'm going to lay out that again in case you didn't pick up on it. But I think this is something I learned from Dr. Jordan Peterson again in his book Maps of Meaning and his lectures and everything. So he talks about how you have the literal realm where you can measure things, facts, objects. The world is composed of cells and substances. We know this from Newtonian ideas and everything. But there's another realm, which is the realm in which we act, the realm in which what we do matters. and this is the place of values. And he argues that we see this other realm of how we act through stories and narratives. So reading how Christ took on the suffering of all, if we believe that that's a good thing, we act that out. Like, obviously, we can't do it on such a grand scale, but we act it out. The spirit of Christ is what we act out. That's what we believe. It's not just what we say, but what we actually act out. So the reason I'm bringing this up is we're kind of going into this memes and archetypes discussion now, too. We can probably close with that later. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because there seems to be a connection there for me, and this isn't worked out, between that symbolic immortality and literal immortality. What do you think about that? If I can, maybe I should lay out some more of my argument first.
Yes.
So you have the truth, which represents the realm in which we act, is what we call metaphorical truth. So a metaphorical truth is what can be literally false, but it works enough for us to be called true. I'll give you an example. So if you, this is something Sam Harris actually proposed. If you have a gun and if you like shooting, you have an implicit rule generally that you always make sure the gun is unloaded and you check every time in case, so that no one dies by accident. Although you could bet your entire life savings that you checked it 5 minutes ago, before giving it to your kid, you'll check it again just to make sure. Just to make sure. That's a metaphorical truth that it is not loaded. So I think there are several of these. For example, believing, and I'm not, again, exhausting, and I'm not even trying to tell you or anyone what is actually true about what happens after we die. But maybe it is true, though, that no matter what is true, it is true that we feel better knowing that we won't die. And it works for us. Like, that we will die, but that we will get somewhere else.
Of course. That's the whole point, is that it quells the existential fear about death. And when the implication here, too, is not, terror management doesn't say anything about whether or not we actually go anywhere. We don't care about that. Because nobody knows. It's unknowable. Yeah. It is absolutely unknowable. It's what you choose to believe.
Yes.
And it's very convenient that most religions have some system built into it that allows for this sort of immortality, with the exception of the Jewish faith, right? They're actually, I'm sure there are lots of religions, but Christianity, for example, is built entirely on this idea of
paradise.
Heaven and hell. Yeah. The Muslim religion, likewise, is built on this. So it's not a matter of whether we know it's true, because we can't know that it's true. But if we can buy into that religion, then we have, that's the literal, when I say literal, that's what I mean. I don't mean that we know, it's literal in that people who believe they are actually going to go somewhere else.
So that's the literal aspect.
Yes.
Like their physical bodies will end up somewhere else.
Or their spirit or whatever.
Yeah,
they will continue to live on literally. So as they are.
Okay.
They will go there and they will see loved ones who have passed away. Whatever.
Yes.
As opposed to the symbolic immortality, which doesn't necessarily say that your body will go on, your spirit will go on. It is just that some meme, maybe, or ideas that you had. Certainly Einstein is still with us.
Your person.
Right, their ideas. That's the symbolic immortality.
Okay,
yes.
I get it.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, I should have been clearer about that before.
No, that's
right.
Good. Because for me, it's always been difficult to see how to concede a literal resurrection, for example, but I can certainly concede a symbolic resurrection where the Christ spirit lives on for sure. I mean, it's the greatest religion in the world. Like when it comes to numbers, so I mean, that does make sense for sure that we have like that are, but it's also in a sense him that lives on, the spirit. Right. Like I live on.
That is the symbolic immortality of him.
Sure. Okay.
If he's sitting up at God's side, that's the literal. If you believe that he's still sitting up there at
Mhm.
God's side, that's the literal piece.
Yes.
The symbolic piece is his ideas, his beliefs, his values are still with us.
Mm-hmm.
And as humans, we have that same opportunity, depending on which cultural worldview we embrace.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't embrace a cultural worldview that says, I get to live literally, when I die, I'm going to go be with my family and continue on, or I'm going to rise up later on into some paradise. If you don't believe that, it's just as effective to believe I'm going to live on through my children.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to live on through books I've written or buildings I've built.
Or
that's more
your
symbolic.
example, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
who you have been and what other people
yes.
attribute to
Yes.
who you used to be.
Mm-hmm.
So you're
right.
So this is a really ancient representation. So it is to embody the death of your father, symbolically speaking. The culture too.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same idea, really, to enter the underworld and take on what I guess allows us to live our values, our culture. This brings us into the idea of archetypes and memes right away, because the good father is an archetype. Well, in Jung's sense, I believe it's that every society has a patriarchal, you could say,
Mm-hmm.
element, but that can be both good and bad. So the king always has an evil brother, is the symbolism here. So we always have the possibility for tyranny, but in the West, for example, we're much less tyrannized than we used to be in the West, and that most other countries are in the world. We have democracies. What would you say is the difference between a meme and an archetype? Because that's something a lot of people are struggling to define.
I cannot add anything to this. To me, they are very similar.
Okay.
I think of a meme. I think of a meme as something more generated by the media.
Okay.
It may be even a matter of time.
Okay.
Right. Whereas archetypes have come to bubble up through eons of generations and the collective unconscious.
Mm-hmm. So they're more embodied in the sense.
Yeah, and they sort of are naturally. I think archetypes. I don't know. I'm going to say this, but I might change my mind later.
Okay.
I think archetypes are deeper.
Yes.
They're more of a representation of what humans really need to know and value and understand.
Uh-huh.
Memes to me are more fleeting.
Yes, they're much more conscious, kind of.
Yeah, and they represent something that's going on very much in the moment.
Uh-huh.
And they can be fleeting and disappear and fritter away, and we'll never remember it 10 years from now. Whereas archetypes, regardless of how you talk about them, whether you talk about them in Jungian terms or biblical terms or whatever, they're there. They're not going anywhere.
Yes, they're kind of eternal in a sense.
Yeah. Yes.
And perhaps you could say an idea is eternal as well, but that it becomes irrelevant in a sense.
It only becomes eternal as long as someone remembers it.
Yes, but it might pop up again too.
It could pop up again.
And this is where it's very arbitrary, because we don't understand how ideas work. We don't understand our consciousness at all.
That's true.
Which, I mean, but it's certainly true. And I want to actually have a quote here from Jung. It's very short. It is that people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. I think he said more like people do not have complexities. Complexities have people. And this idea, you could say, is that we're not necessarily in control of the ideas. The ideas push us.
Where do the ideas come from?
Well, they're usually not our own ideas, though. Like,
they gotta originate somewhere.
Yes, well, sometimes creative people come up with new ideas.
Yes.
but most of us operate on cliches and what we've heard other people say. So the ideas that have worked for a long time, like archetypes, they're much older ideas, and though the ideas that led us, this is becoming extremely complicated. Um, well, I think that I'm not saying we don't make ideas or we don't think about ideas, but I'm just saying, like, it's not that there are ideas. The ideas are like our masters in a sense. So you are a professor because you had an idea one time that you want to be a professor, and you became a professor, and all your studying is based on the ideas of liking studying and of enjoying what you're doing, or being terrified by it, but feeling like you have to read and have to study. So we're pushed, and of course, emotions are definitely part of our ideas as well, of our thinking. We're certainly pressured by our drive, our motivations, which are emotional in their deepest sense. So
do you think archetypes have had an evolutionary purpose?
I think so. I think so. I think
so they've evolved.
I think so.
Along with humans, along with our minds?
Perhaps. Yes, perhaps. I think, well, yeah, I do think so. I think they are what's useful for us. It's useful to think that you're a hero and act out the hero story, like I mentioned earlier, and not act out the tragedy.
Right.
Because you really can pick a tragedy.
And in that sense, now we're back to sort of memes. Because if you consider a meme in the very way that Dawkins saw it, which was, as a gene,
a unit of
as a unit, that gets transferred from person to person, then now we're back to the square one where the archetype is a meme. It's the same thing, right? It depends how you define it.
Well,
because
I think that memes, because they're ideas, they're conscious, they're cognitive, while archetypes are this is hard, but I think that the archetypes are like an electromagnetic field almost. They're deeper, as you said. They're Jung had a dream one time, and you know how the psychoanalysts are with dreams. I'm really intrigued by the dream ideas. He had a dream one time that he and Freud were digging in, I think it was Freud's basement, and Jung dug deeper than Freud and found like thousands of rooms where he could, thousands of rooms he could explore. And I think that maybe, symbolically speaking, where Freud was the realm of memes, and where Jung was the realm of archetypes, which is perhaps why he was the first one who started talking about archetypes in that sense. Represented through our dreams, through stories, through mythology, deep understandings of human values and virtues and human behavioral patterns. And I think that we can say almost with certainty that, for example, and now it sounds like I'm confusing them, but I don't think I am. The Oedipal mother is a representation of the tyrannical mother, although she seems as the good mother because she's just taking care of the kid. So in Hansel and Gretel, I think Gretel, Hansel and Gretel, when they go to the ginger house, they are fed a lot. It's the Oedipal mother. But they're fed just enough so that she can eat them, which perhaps might be what's happening. And we in a home where the children never leave, they're being fed and they like being fed, but they're never going to grow up. So I think that that's an archetype that we can distinguish with a qualitative judgment from the hero or the good mother that allows her son independence and autonomy, and that won't feed it enough gingerbread so she could eat it. And I think that idea works a lot better for humans because the sons and the daughters need to get out in the world and continue living than the tyrannical mother, where they don't do that, where they're trapped in the house and become food.
Yes. And so we're in the realm. I realize that Jung is considered a psychologist, but this feels much more philosophy-like to me.
Yes.
And I don't myself personally feel a need or are particularly comfortable talking about archetypes in this way.
Okay.
Because when I hear you say these things, and I don't disagree with them, but it makes much more sense to me to talk about it in more sort of modern terms of authoritarian parents or authoritative parents who I just worry that when we start talking about things like archetypes, we just lose people. They don't know what we're talking about anymore.
Maybe we sometimes lose people talking about the truth.
Say more about that.
Well, I think that I see your concern. I share your concern. I mean, I know that a lot of people you talk to won't be able to understand our ideas 100%, but I don't think that should exhaust our inquiry of them or discussion of them. But I also one of the reasons why I'm really shocked by the archetypal ideas is actually because of how popular Jordan Peterson is talking about Jung. He's become so popular talking about Jung, and people they're almost entranced by his Jungian interpretation of mythology and such.
And I'm not familiar with Jordan Peterson or his interpretation. And anytime I hear the term interpretation, I get concerned.
Okay. Regardless, if you have time, I would certainly recommend checking out his views on this, because I mean his book is #1 in behavioral psychology on Amazon, and his other book is also it sold like 2 million copies just this year, I believe. Yeah.
And so what is he is he attempting to apply Jung's theories to modern problems?
If you want me to explain about Jordan Peterson, I can.
I'm curious, and okay. I think others might be, because you've mentioned him several times.
Well, he firstly, I should probably build up the ethos. He is among the top 2.5% of scientists on ResearchGate.net. He's a very, very distinguished scientist on personality and on alcohol and such things. But he's studied Jung very independently, and what he's trying to discover is the relationship between meaning in life and responsibility, which I've come to think is perhaps the deepest connection there is in life. That when we take on responsibility, we find meaning. And he uses how Jung views the archetypes as, I guess you could say, kind of, it's hard to actually understand 100% what he wants to do with Jung, but he has made Jung more accessible to many, I think. Because Jung is not a very accessible author. It's very difficult. His texts are very difficult, and even as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I've heard, even a lot of professors don't even touch him because they're not interested in the relationship between.
Because we can't test those theories.
That's one thing.
That's the main thing.
Yes.
That we're in the realm of philosophy and not in the realm of empirical science.
Of course, I mean but there are a lot of overlaps too, and if we want to do what's best for humanity, we look at overlaps in philosophy and science.
I agree.
Like what are the limits of rationality? That's a philosophical question, certainly.
Right.
But philosophy only means the love of wisdom.
Yes, no, I understand, but in terms
of
giving up, why people have given up talking about Freud, talking about Jung, trying to spend time figuring out what they meant, is because there's no way to do it. It's all conjecture. It's all, we're guessing what he was thinking, and there's no testing it. I mean, you can link it together. You can use his ideas to link these ideas of meaning in life and responsibility. But in terms of it being any sort of science that helps us better understand human behavior from a scientific standpoint, it's difficult.
It's difficult. But talking about Oedipal complex, for example, I would say it's hard to prove the Oedipal complex by using like an equation, but you can see it in clinical practice, for example.
Which is not science.
Sure.
It's
psychology, though.
It is psychology. It is, right.
And Jung was a psychiatrist.
Yes, I agree that, yes, he was. That as a psychoanalysis in general has gone by the wayside because
it's a romantic school. It puts emotions over
there's
rationality.
Because there's no real way to test what, first of all, what an Oedipal mother really is, and whether that has a negative effect on someone's outcome. Which in psychology, for me anyway, that's what I'm interested in.
I see your point. I really do. I think here is where the theory of having two different realities fits in, really. Because in the realm of how we act, it might be really useful in clinical practice, for example, to know that if you have an Oedipal mother, it might be a good idea to jump out of that jail cell if you can escape it.
But don't you think there are other ways to talk about that rather than using,
I mean, you wouldn't tell your
sort
patient
of romanticized, antiquated ideas of an Oedipal mother?
Like, you wouldn't tell your patient you are the victim of an Oedipal mother, but if you know, which you might never find out, that he or she is.
Trick. You might never ever find out.
Yes, but if you do, you might understand the problem better.
How do you find that out, though?
By observing it.
But you're still, again, not observing.
And by what they say, and by their dreams. By what they share with you, and what they allow themselves to share with you. You can tell to a certain degree. That's something I've heard clinicians talk about several times, how, I mean, you can't just know by looking at them, and you probably won't be invited to go and have an experiment in their house, how they act, but you can see it if you're familiar enough with the theories. Like, you can see a relationship where the son, who is like 50, lives with his mom still, and he's not.
Yeah, you can see that on an individual level, but what if you went out and we learn things in psychology by studying massive amounts of people.
Yes.
And first of all, I want to say I have nothing against psychoanalysis. I love Freud. Okay. I love Jung. But after 8 years of training in science, you come to realize that there is no empirical method that can address the ideas that they have. Their ideas can give us ideas about how to study
and open
these
up
things.
New fields and such.
Yes, but in terms of, again, when psychologists say they don't spend time on Jung, this is why. Is because everybody will just throw up their hands and say, hey, you can't prove it. Yes. You can't do a randomized control study.
And
you can't do an experiment. And the only way to determine cause and effect is by doing an experiment. And the only way to do that is to have random assignment and to, subject one group to something and another group to the other and measure the same thing. And there's just no way to do that. Sure. You can't randomly assign someone, I don't know, to have an Oedipal mother or not.
I got an idea just now, though. This might be foundationless, but it sounds right to me in a moment at least. So today we often talk about how we're more overprotective of our children, how we don't allow them to be to challenge themselves outside, and we have safe spaces on campus and all that stuff because we don't want them to get hurt.
Correct.
But humans are not wine glasses. Humans are beings that need to be challenged. So perhaps you could say, like, a grand scale Oedipal situation is going on.
Why though?
Why?
Why?
Well,
why couldn't you?
More and more children live at home. More and more people.
I know, but why do we have to talk about it from an Oedipal? Why can't we talk about? It's a useful way to see it, I think. That's where I disagree, I guess. I don't think it's useful. I think it is useful to target a parent's particular behavior. And to look at how that behavior may be affecting a child positively or negatively, and then stepping in and saying, you need to not do this behavior anymore. Couching it in all of this Oedipal stuff, well, I think it doesn't bias anything.
Of course, it's not useful to tell someone who never had any experience with psychological language or even Jungian language, if you want to take it separated from psychological language, which you might, because, I mean, Jung is special. That's fine, but I think to understand a problem, as scientists, as philosophers, as anyone who loves ideas or anything like that, pursuit of knowledge, of wisdom, I think we need to grapple with the root of the problem. And I think, as I've mentioned briefly today, that Jung is looking at the root of the problem and that perhaps not everyone will understand it, but those who do and those who can, maybe they're up to something that's really good. Maybe they're finding out that maybe these behaviors that we're allowing in, that we're making it seem more normal that we overprotect children than not overprotecting them, because you might see someone let their kid do something that you might think is dangerous, but they might think is necessary because you can't trap them and not let them get hurt ever. Then maybe allowing those ideas are more dangerous. So if we understand the root of the problem, perhaps we're going to be less likely to live the problem out on a grand scale. That's all I can
and again,
come up with right now.
Again, where I'll disagree.
Sure.
I do think it. I think Freudian ideas, Jungian ideas have gotten psychologists to where they are now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think now, and I am not a strict behaviorist.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Gold is a strict behaviorist.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to talk to her about such things.
Sure.
But I am very much of the belief that if we can't see it and we can't measure it, that it's not very useful in psychology.
Okay.
If again, it depends what we call psychology.
Mm.
I mean, if
I see.
If it's about changing behavior, which is again describe, explain, predict, change, optimize. That's the goal. That's what we teach every incoming student. We're trying to describe it. We're trying to explain why it happens. And this is sure, Jung and Freud may help in us explaining stuff, but when it comes down to trying to predict what's going to happen in the future or to make some change that changes behavior, then I think we have to leave them behind.
I understand.
So
I'll give one quick comment to that, and then we'll move on to. I wanted to look into implicit bias, unless you're really eager to do that.
I am not.
Okay.
Because it's a whole other.
Yes, it is. Just a quick comment on that. I think, from what it sounds to me, what you said is that if we want to help people, it might not be as useful digging this deep.
Mm-hmm.
But see that this is where I kind of want to go back to, just quickly, what I said earlier, that I think the first job of the psychiatrist is to tell the patient that, well, he's the one responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's possible to clue him in that there's something deep going on here, something that might have negative connotation, perhaps he, as the hero in his own life, in his own story, may find the way out. And complicated, sure. It's hard for scientists to change behavior by just showing results as well, because scientific literature is really inaccessible to the average person who never had scientific training. So, I mean, there's a lot of complications here with, well, will our good intentions and our social experiments ever help anyone? Because our ideas take negative turns. Although they are very influential, they don't always get us where we want them to end up.
But they allow us to build more easily.
They do, and that's really good. That's why conversations like this is really good, because some of the ideas I have you might not have heard of, and vice versa, obviously.
Right.
Well, just for fun, last topic.
All right.
Conspiracy theories.
What a boy.
Okay. I was going to ask you, is it right to suppress conspiracy theories? But maybe I should ask you a harder question, which would be something like, how do you think they even started?
Conspiracies?
Yes.
Conspiracies are a result of people trying to explain things that they do not understand. They oftentimes don't spend a lot of time trying to figure out what really happened. So they grab onto the most convenient thing. Now we're tying back to memes as well, because then you hear something. Oh, well, that must be what happened. That's the answer. So we know that humans have a tendency for mental shortcuts. We like mental shortcuts. Mental shortcuts are very useful, right? It allows us to categorize and make sense of everything. We're being bombarded constantly with information.
Gives us time to do other things.
So the quicker we can make sense of something, especially that doesn't make sense on its surface, the better. So I think conspiracy theories are natural in that sense. But there are also, and I don't know a lot about this, I will admit, there are also huge individual differences in the types of people who are willing to engage in conspiracy theory versus those who don't. And I don't know the literature.
Yes.
I would think it might have something to do with education, the ability to think critically, certainly just general intelligence
For
levels.
example, openness to experiment.
Yes.
To experience sounds like it would be more likely than
Perhaps.
than if you're just, a conservative or orderly person. Like if you're very open to new ideas, it might click.
Mm-mm.
You don't think so?
No, I don't feel that at all. No? I think, in fact, I would say that conspiracy theorists are more likely to be much more rigid in their thinking than open.
Okay.
I think because they want something that they can grasp onto and just hang on to that. So we know, for example, when we study political ideology, that conservatives as a group are very uncomfortable. They have something called high need for closure, meaning that they're not comfortable operating in gray areas. When they're presented with something, they need to say, okay, this is it, and I don't want to entertain it. I don't want to think about anything else.
Put a box on it, right?
Right. Put a box on it, and I don't want to think about the gray areas. So there's a lot more rigidity, again, typically in conservative type thinking.
Okay.
Which at the same
time, I agree with that, yes.
This is where you see a lot of conspiracy. And I don't know. You probably see conspiracy equally on the left and right. I don't know. Do you know anything about that?
That's a good question.
I tend to believe that you see it more on the right, but that might be my own.
Yeah, no, I think that's a hard one to put on any scale of political. Yeah, on any political.
Well, though, again, we understand quite a lot.
They're quite an anomaly, I would say.
Yeah, but we understand a lot of. Yeah, you're right.
Like Alex Jones, I wouldn't know where to put him. Like alt-right is the closest you can get, but his ideas are pretty damn crazy. Like they're ranging from a plethora of pedophiles in Hollywood to aliens being behind different.
Right.
I mean, I'm no expert on Alex Jones.
Right. Yeah.
But they're really hard to define, which is one of the reasons why I think it's kind of a fun topic to discuss in the first place. Because one thing is for sure, they like what you're saying, to find this like worldview that lets them. Maybe it has lets them feel that they know what's going on. Maybe it has something to do with intellect too, that we want to understand everything, right? Because if you're there's a typical philosophical theme. For example, in Goethe, you have Mephistopheles, right? The intellect that certainly is vicious and malevolent, but nevertheless the intellect. And you see this in Brothers Karamazov and everything. Like the smart person is not always the good person.
Right.
So maybe it has something to do with intelligence, like how if you're intelligent, you don't become better at distinguishing between different views. You become better at arguing for your own view, which I think
perhaps.
That's what I've heard, that it doesn't make you better at understanding other people necessarily. It makes you better at understanding what you want to understand and the things that you already pursue. And you perhaps become more rigid when you're when you're really smart than when you're not as smart, and you give some credit to other people. You know?
I don't want to conflate intelligence with any kinds of rigidity in thinking. I think if you looked at all of the intelligent people, you would see a broad spectrum.
I see what you're saying. I'm not saying they're rigid in that they're the same. I'm saying that the intellect falls in love with its own productions, with what it can come up to itself. We think that we can explain everything by using theories, for example, and which I think
or facts.
Or facts, but facts.
This is the thing that conspiracy theorists don't do.
Yes.
They don't explain things with facts.
But they think they say they have evidence though, which is very rarely true.
Right.
But they like try as hard as they can to explain how the Twin Towers could not have fallen this way based on some sort of evidence and some sort of doctor here and there.
Right.
Doesn't make it true.
Right.
But theories are, in scientific theories are an aggregation of facts that we can prove, experiments that have been proven. So I see your point there. It's just, I think that this is one reason why you see that there are so many different schools in psychology, because different figures come up with their stuff, and they do their best to discover what they can in their own ideas and to explore on their own ideas. And they like Freud made it an entire school, and then some people break off that school, but then you have some people like me who I really understand different theories, and I take some from everything, right? Doesn't mean like that I'm not smart or anything, but I think that just because you're smart doesn't mean you're willing to concede other points. Like, you like your own production still, you stand by yourself and your own stuff.
Bring this back to conspiracy theory, though. So what is your point?
So I think the intellect wants to understand everything. It wants to be the one that explains what's going on.
So you think people of higher intelligence are more likely to have conspiracy theories to embrace?
It's more the contrary, that people who like conspiracy theories probably aren't stupid necessarily. They're probably pretty smart, but they're using it wrong.
I think they're lazy.
Maybe lazy too.
They're lazy thinkers.
Maybe they're those who are not conscientious but very intelligent.
That could be.
They're the ones who sit behind their computers all the time and find stuff online. This is obviously not something I've explored.
Right, no, me neither.
It's just popped in my mind,
yeah.
because the intellect wants to understand, and also does not want you to think that you can't understand it. Like, it doesn't want to concede that this is a gray area, because it wants to understand everything. That's why we jump to conclusions all the time. At least that's like how I see it.
Yeah, but that's still a very different quality than believing things that are outrageous and not true.
That's fine, but
why is there a need? See, to me, it's motivated. There's a need, and I don't know what the need is, for someone, for example, to believe that aliens came here thousands of years ago and built our civilization. Why is there a need to believe that? I
think that what they used to say is that a bad explanation beats no explanation every day.
Yeah, but why?
Not on the in the factual sense, but in the subjective sense.
But there are lots of explanations about how we got here.
But not about aliens.
Yeah, but why? Why even bring aliens into it? We have religions that totally lay out. Every religion lays out for us how we got here, how the world was created.
Maybe they have a lot of questions with those theories, and certainly.
So it's easier for them to make up.
Maybe
a different one,
maybe it's more attractive to have their own theory of things.
That's what I'm asking. I mean, that's what I'm thinking about here is there must be something satisfying.
Yes.
And rewarding about...
You're special. You're unique. Your take is the one take that's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which might be the thing with the intellect, because as I said, and it's not my quote, I believe it actually was Goethe who said that the intellect falls in love with its own productions. It might have been Dostoevsky. I'm not 100% sure. But they share many of the same ideas. It's a romantic idea that we view our ability to think, our rationality, over our emotional life. But in truth, many of the things that we do and our ideas, as we talked about earlier, they really control us to a large degree as well. Like our anger, our hunger can control us. Conspiracy theories are...
Yeah, I think we should do some research.
Maybe we should do that next time.
We should do definitely dig into...
Implicit bias and conspiracy theories.
Okay, deal.
Dr. Anson, it's been really fun. It's been interesting. I did not see us go down the roads we have gone down today with clothing and everything. So, I thank you so much for coming on, and we'll plan another topic for next time.
That sounds great, Marius. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.